Hello, I'm Krasi Ivanova-Twig, and this is the Global Jigsaw podcast from BBC Monitoring. We follow media in up to 100 languages. Our Russia team, for example, reads newspapers and watches state TV 24/7. And they have picked up on a curious phenomenon that might surprise those who are not immersed in the Kremlin narrative-creating machine. We'll be talking about the UK and how it seems to have become Russia's enemy number one. To tell us more about it, in the studio with me is Bryn Windsor, one of our Kremlin Watcher colleagues. Bryn, Russian propagandists directing their ire at their enemy is nothing new. We have heard the phrase the collective West as a kind of catch-all term, and the rhetoric is very much enemy-focused. So where's the UK in all of this?
So ever since BBC Monitoring was founded on the eve of the Second World War, our Russia team has been very much plugged into the Kremlin media machine 24/7. And as you say, harsh criticism of the West is nothing new in Russian media. Since the start of the war in Ukraine, the narrative has always been that Russia is fighting not just Ukraine, but the whole Western world. It's an easy narrative for the Kremlin because it not only helps mobilize support for the war, but it also justifies to the Russian people why this war that was supposed to last just a few days is now in its fifth year. And at the outbreak of the conflict in Ukraine, Russian media really presented the USA as the leader of the collective West. And so that was all well and good for the Kremlin propaganda for the first few years of the war. And then in late 2024, they were presented with somewhat of a problem. And that, of course, was the re-election of Donald Trump. Now, as we're all aware, Donald Trump has been pursuing this kind of rapprochement of sorts with Moscow. And, we had the big Putin-Trump meeting in Alaska and so on. And from our point of view at BBC Monitoring, we've seen on Russian TV that the Kremlin propagandists kind of eyeing a Russia-friendly peace deal have kind of reined in the criticism of the US. And at the same time, we've noticed an uptick in criticism of another Western partner, and that is, of course, the United Kingdom. I should say that criticism of the UK on Russian TV in itself isn't new. The UK's strong support for Ukraine has been it's definitely not gone unnoticed in Russia. Former Prime Minister Boris Johnson, he's a familiar face on Russian TV. He's still very much portrayed as this warmonger, this person who is responsible for derailing peace talks early in the war in 2022. But ever since Trump's re-election, we've seen a real acceleration in the anti-British rhetoric on Russian TV. It's visible not just in the propaganda shows that we're watching on TV, but also in the official statements. Just in the last year, we've had the Russian Foreign Intelligence Service coming out and saying that Britain is the quote-unquote main instigator of global conflict. Britain has been referred to as the puppet masters of the Ukrainian security services. The UK is supposedly on this multi-year campaign to ensure the strategic defeat of Russia. The UK is accused of all sorts of terrorism and sabotage in Russia as well.
But have Kremlin propagandists or officials actually spelled it out that the UK is now enemy number one, top enemy, whatever they have called it?
Yeah, so after noticing this uptick in anti-British rhetoric, what we did at BBC Monitoring's Russia team, we actually ran the data. So we took the output of 4 of Russia's top political propaganda talk show programs. This is a very familiar format on Russian TV where you have a kind of a pro-Kremlin host with a lot of kind of Kremlin-aligned pundits, and they're like debating the day's news. And so we analyzed the output of all of these shows, and we found that not only had mentions of the UK jumped significantly in the start of the war, they jumped significantly again after Donald Trump's re-election. So we can see a kind of shift perhaps in the narrative, a shift in the criticism towards the UK. UK prime ministers are mentioned on these propaganda talk show programs actually all of the time. I mentioned Boris Johnson, but Keir Starmer as well. He's presented to Russian viewers very much as this person who's kind of trying to disrupt a dialogue between Moscow and Washington to end the war. UK prime ministers, we found interestingly, are actually mentioned far more on these programs than Russia's own prime minister, Mikhail Mishustin. And so there is a real sense that the UK is being kind of recast as this public enemy in Russian media. There was a report from Reuters, for example. They cited a Russian government source not long after Donald Trump's re-election, who said that, yes, it's true that the UK really is the kind of the new target. So the Russian media machine needs an external enemy. It needs it for public consumption, for cohesion of the system in Russia. And so as the Kremlin cuts back in criticizing the US, it seems like that the UK is emerging as public enemy number one.
And how is the UK portrayed in Moscow to justify this status as enemy number one? What is the threat the UK poses?
The basic image of the UK, which is being presented on Russian TV, is this command center of the war against Russia being waged in Ukraine. There's a strong civilizational aspect to the framing. So the UK is really presented as this like epitome of this decaying Western liberal civilization, which is different to the Russian civilization, which is, presented as the protector of traditional conservative values, etc. Whilst the US is, of course, a large military power and is very much presented as Russia's equal, albeit opponent, but Russia's equal, the UK is, of course, much smaller. The UK military is much smaller. And so the threat of the UK, as presented in Russian media, is one really of a country which can disrupt, which can manipulate Russia. Just in the last year or so since Trump's re-election, we're seeing the phrase "Коварный Альбион" coming up on Russian media quite a lot. That basically translates to perfidious Albion, Albion being this kind of historic term for the British Isles. And perfidious Albion is a phrase that actually first emerged during the Napoleonic Wars in France.
But as you say, the UK military is small, yet it's presented as having this outsized power to manipulate.
Yeah, and this is one of the really interesting findings we found in our research, is that references to UK military capacity on Russian TV are actually quite small. The UK military isn't actually mentioned much at all, but the UK intelligence services, so MI6, GCHQ and everything else, they're mentioned all of the time on Russian TV. Watching some of these programs, you could actually have the impression that the MI6 is behind basically all of Russia's problems. So just to list the operations that Russia have officially said in statements that the UK intelligence services are responsible for, there was Operation Spiderweb in 2025. That was a big secret Ukrainian drone operation to take out some high-value Russian military targets deep inside Russian territory. UK intelligence have been blamed for the Nord Stream pipeline explosion. That was a big gas pipeline carrying Russian gas to Europe. The UK is blamed for funding a fifth column of anti-Kremlin activists and journalists inside Russia, and kind of the idea that the UK intelligence service is somehow fomenting discontent among ethnic minorities in Russia in order to destabilize the country. So that's one half of the narrative, that the UK is this nefarious actor. But the other half is that the UK is this kind of society in terminal decline. So the UK, the Russian media, he actually reports quite a lot on UK domestic politics. There's a program on Russia 1. It's called Britain with Alexander Khabarov. He's the London correspondent for this big state channel, Russia 1. And he's always focused on elements of political discord, conversations and debate around the cost of living, around migration, political and royal scandals. One last thing I'd add is that a strong element of this narrative is also Britain's colonial history. So on Russian TV and in Russia's official statements, they often like to remind the world of the victims of British colonialism, and they kind of present the UK as this country suffering from a kind of post-imperial rigor mortis, as it were, that the country is, not overcome the loss of its empire.
So those two narratives, it seems to me that they're quite contradictory. Mm-hmm. So how can they coexist? The idea that this is a imperial power in decline, a relic, and at the same time, it's so powerful, it can be the main disruptor in the world.
Exactly. So there is a central contradiction in the Russian narrative that the UK is in terminal decline, yet simultaneously more dangerous to Russia than ever before. And you could argue that it's in some ways even a backhanded compliment to Britain. The Russian media is almost overstating Britain's strategic capability, giving credit to Britain for a lot more than it's actually doing in practice. We know that Britain, for example, whilst being a big supporter of Ukraine, it doesn't contribute the same amount as the US has done historically. It doesn't contribute the same amount to Ukraine as Germany, for example. But I would say that these kind of contradictions, they don't really matter for the Kremlin media machine. The goal of the propaganda is very much to simplify a complex world. The regime needs an external enemy to define itself.
Can you give us a taste of some of the language that officials and propagandists are using that would leave us in no doubt where the UK stands?
For sure. So probably the most famous piece of anti-British rhetoric on Russian TV was in 2022, just a few months into the war, when Dmitry Kiselyov, he's one of the big state propagandists, addressing Boris Johnson, the then Prime Minister, very directly.
Термоядерная торпеда у берегов Британии поднимет гигантскую волну, цунами высотой до 500
He warned that the explosion of a Russian thermonuclear torpedo off the coast of Britain will raise this giant radioactive wave of up to 500 meters and then sink the UK and turn whatever's left of it into a radioactive desert. We had Vladimir Solovyov, another big, popular propagandist. He recently repeated the same threat about sinking the UK, and he actually joked that Russian ships should be careful not to scratch their hulls on Big Ben after the Russian torpedo sinks the UK. We've had Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov. He recently said that he thinks that Britain should be called just Britain because there's no other country in the world that calls itself great. So he doesn't think that Great Britain should be Great Britain, it should be just Britain. We had Maria Zakharova, she's the spokeswoman for the foreign ministry in Russia. She called the UK the epicenter of fake news production. We've had Bortnikov, he's the director of the Domestic Intelligence Services, the FSB. He's called the British the puppet masters of the Ukrainian special services. Solovyov, again, recently he said on TV, he was almost lamenting that Russia had not destroyed London or Birmingham. And in one other recent tirade that hit quite close to home for those of us that work at the BBC, he criticized the BBC's Russia editor Steve Rosenberg.
Мы не выгнали отсюда гребаные BBC
со Стивом Ротенбергом, который ходит с лицом какающей белочки.
He said, "We haven't kicked out the goddamn BBC with that Stephen Rottenberg. He walks around looking like a defecating squirrel. He's a conscious enemy of our country." And so probably my favorite piece of anti-British rhetoric on Russian TV came from Dmitry Medvedev, the former Russian president who stepped in for Vladimir Putin for a few years and a prolific social media user. He wrote recently, "Britain was, is, and always will be our eternal enemy, at least until the insolent, unpleasantly damp island sinks into the sea, swallowed by a wave created by Russia's latest weapon system." And he signed the post off saying, "Let it be," as the Beatles sang.
I confirm it is very damp,
So,
indeed.
not a fan of Britain, but a fan of British music at least. So there's something.
But you hinted that this animosity towards the UK is not new. And there's a long history going back, 200 years?
Exactly. So kind of the emergence of the UK as Russia's principal foe, at least in Russian media, is not new because it really represents a return to the past. There's an Anglo-Russian rivalry which has existed for centuries. And this is probably best exemplified by a phrase we've been seeing a lot on Russian TV recently. It's a very historically loaded phrase that's familiar to any Russian, but probably not to many Brits. It's Anglichanka gadget. Now, Anglichanka gadget translates roughly to the English woman is doing the dirty. So gadget in Russian, the verb, has two meanings. On the one hand, it can mean to defecate or to excrete, but more figuratively, it conveys this idea of kind of spoiling and disrupting. And so the phrase basically means that Britain is scheming against Russia. It's widely believed that the phrase originated in the Crimean War. So that was a conflict between Victorian Britain and the Tsarist Empire in the 1850s. The phrase re-emerged in the 19th century during the Great Game. That was a conflict between, again, Victorian Britain and the Russian Empire, who kind of vied for influence in Central Asia and Persia. And then it was noticed again in Russian historical documents in the 1920s, when the British state was assisting white Russians in their fight against the new Bolshevik government during the Russian Civil War. And ever since the start of the conflict in Ukraine, and especially since Trump's re-election, we've seen this phrase, Anglichanka gadget, really reappear in Russian political lexicon. And our data analysis at BBC Monitoring, we tracked the output of political talk shows, of newspapers in Russia, and Telegram channels. That's Russia's biggest and most popular messaging app. And we can see a real increase in the use of this anti-British moniker.
You talk about the animosity and a long history, but at the same time, there has been a period where attitudes were much softer. Wave of Anglophilia in the 90s, and then London was called Londongrad or Moscow on Thames.
As long as Anglophobia has existed in Russia, so have signs of Anglophilia. So whilst there were periods of tension, like there are now, during the Cold War, during the Crimean War, the Russian Civil War, there were, of course, periods of great collaboration, like in the First World War, in the Second World War, even in the Napoleonic Wars, when the British Empire and the Russian Empire were allies at certain periods. We shouldn't forget, of course, that the Russian and British royal families, they were closely related. Queen Victoria's granddaughter was married to Tsar Nicholas II. Even long before then, Peter the Great, this great modernizing Tsar who built St. Petersburg, he was known to be a great Anglophile. Tales of Peter the Great's travels to London in 1698, they're legendary. And if you're interested in Russian history, there are these amazing tales of Peter the Great, the Tsar of Russia, cavorting in disguise in London pubs and taverns. He did an apprenticeship at the dockyards in Deptford. And after Peter the Great returned to Russia in the 1690s, there was this great period of Anglophilia, which basically overtook Russian high society and intellectual circles. And as you mentioned, the most recent example was probably in the early 1990s, when there was this influx of new rich Russians into London, the kind of Londongrad, as they called it, Moscow on Thames, where these, new gilded Russian elite would go around the Mayfair boutiques. They would send their children to English private schools. There was lots of work for London lawyers and real estate agents and so on. And the climax of that whole trend was probably when Roman Abramovich bought Chelsea Football Club in 2003. There was even a television show on Russian TV as recently as 2015 called Londongrad. And it's this comedic show about how basically depicting the lives of, rich Russians living in London. There was, of course, Putin's visit to London in 2003. Putin was invited to Buckingham Palace, and there's footage of him online kind of clinking glasses with Queen Elizabeth and talking about the Russian-British friendship. It's one of the few examples where we've actually seen Putin talking in English, for example. It seems like a very distant reality from where we are at the moment.
Fast forward to 2026, and it is where we are with UK kind of overtaking the US as top enemy. But it does make you wonder. I understand the logic of that, but it makes you wonder, okay, there are other countries in Western Europe. Why not France or Germany?
Yeah, it's a very good point. And I should say that Germany and France are also criticized a hell of a lot on Russian TV nowadays. Emmanuel Macron's personal life is a very popular topic among Russian media presenters, and kind of the UK, France and Germany, they're often lumped together and referred to with terms like the Anglo-Europeans or the European Party of War. That's a phrase we've really seen kind of re-emerge in Russian media since Trump's re-election. And there's a sense also from the Russian descriptions in the media that the UK has some kind of influence over the US because of the long US-UK historic relationship, and the US is still presented as the ultimate decision maker. And the fact that the UK can supposedly still influence the US makes it much more of a target, I would say, for the Russian media. And there's, as I said, there's all of these historic cliches that exist about UK-Russian relations. We talk about it in here as well. There's often perceived to be this kind of rivalry that exists between MI6 and the KGB. You only need to kind of watch the James Bond films or read the works of John le Carré, Tinker Tailor Soldier Spy, and all of these kind of things to get a sense of that narrative. And while it can seem kind of cliched, this is really important for how the Russian media build their propaganda message, build their media messaging.
What do you think this messaging, this officially sanctioned Anglophobia, what effect does it have on public opinion? How do you read the polls?
Of course, there's public polling in Russia, but it's a very restricted society, so you have to take that polling with a pinch of salt. But even that kind of official polling found that in 1991, this is the Levada Center, one of Russia's big sociological centers, they found in 1991, 75% of Russians had a positive view of the UK. This was just after the fall of the Soviet Union. In 2024, they found that 70% of Russians now have a negative view of the UK. There's a Ukrainian think tank report which looked into the public perceptions of the Russian people, and they found that in 2022, the UK was perceived as a hostile state to Russia, but it was less hostile than the US and Poland. But then when they redid their study in 2025, they found that the UK actually overtook the US as the kind of hostile actor towards Russia, and the UK now sits more or less on par with Germany as the kind of perceived to be the most hostile states to Russia. There's definitely data to indicate that the propaganda is at least having some kind of effect, kind of having some kind of creating a hostile image of the UK in the minds of the Russian people.
Let's play devil's advocate for a moment. These are words, it's rhetoric, yes, it's insult, it's hyperbole. But so what? What does it matter if it doesn't translate into action, into aggression, into violence? Or does it tell us something about Russian intentions in times of war?
Exactly. In many ways, the media messaging and the kind of rhetoric directed at the UK, it can appear as just like crude political trolling. Some of these statements coming from Medvedev and Solovyov, etc. The nuclear threats, I think, thank God, still appear to be moving in a kind of realm of hyperbole. But you've got to think, played out over a long period, this rhetoric can condition the viewer to perceive the UK as an enemy, as somehow out to get Russia. And by normalizing the language of war, the propaganda kind of lowers the threshold potentially for escalation.
And indeed, many European governments have noticed signs of what they call intensified attacks, whether it's physical attacks on supply lines, on power grids, but also cyber information warfare. And military chiefs are talking about needing more money to boost defenses. Mm-hmm. Is that message landing with the government?
The defense establishment in the UK and in Europe, they've been talking about this threat for a very long time. Russia is identified as the most acute threat to UK security in the Strategic Defence Review. We had the UK Chief of Defence Staff, Sir Richard Knighton, say that the threat to the UK is greater now than at any time since the Cold War.
We have seen long-range aviation from Russia go well into our own airspace. NATO scrambled 700 times in response to Russian activity.
The director of GCHQ and of MI6 have said similar things about the kind of threat to the UK of hybrid Russian actions. To what extent the reality of this hybrid warfare, of this escalation with Russia, has kind of fixed itself in the public consciousness, I think is unclear at this point. Does the average Brit understand the kind of things that are being said about them on Russian TV? I'm not sure they do, frankly. Of course, we shouldn't forget that much of this rhetoric, it kind of cuts both ways. And so we have a lot of reporting about Russia here in the UK, and a lot of that reporting can, in many ways, similarly fall into like tropes, into this, into sensationalism, can lean on kind of Cold War narratives and spy scare stories and etc. But I would say that it's nothing compared to some of the open threats being directed towards the UK in Russian media. And I guess the first rule with propaganda is you shouldn't take it at its word. But propaganda does mean something. Propaganda narratives, they are a reflection and also a kind of a driver of a political trajectory. We saw that with the invasion of Ukraine and the kind of things that Russia was saying about before the invasion. And as for now, in the case of the UK and Russia, that trajectory definitely seems to be towards escalation.
Thank you very much, Bryn, and thank you for watching from the Global Jigsaw podcast team. And if you're interested in finding out more about BBC Monitoring, you can do so by visiting our website monitoring.bbc.co.uk.